I have the great opportunity to introduce and speak with one of our two special guests. In 2015, she was the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and she actually shepherded the negotiations and directly oversaw the delivery of the historic Paris Agreement. You may have heard of that before. Today, she's the co-founder of the NGO Global Optimism and co-author of the book, The Future We Choose. And of course, we are in COVID times, so she's joining us via Zoom because we do that now. So please join me in welcoming Christiana Figueres.
Thank you, Zinhle. Can you all hear me?
We can.
Yes? Do we have good? Okay, wonderful. Zinhle, it's so good to see you. Thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers for letting me join you this way, well, despite the fact that I'm not in New York. I know it has been a completely crazy circus week, and it continues. So I guess, thanks very much for taking the time to have this important conversation today, because how we report on climate and the stories that we tell, the narrative that we set in people's imagination and in their understanding will substantially determine whether we're able to address climate change in a timely fashion. So
absolutely.
No pressure on anyone in the room, but the way that you report climate is actually going to have a huge impact on, let me put it this way, just to put it very, very easily for you. How about the way you report climate is going to have a huge impact on the quality of life of the next 7 generations. How's that? No pressure, friends, no pressure.
Christiana, I mean, you say no pressure, but of course this is a journalism institute, so I can't bury the lead. Let's talk about a group that you've been putting some pressure on. I'm talking, of course, about an op-ed that you wrote in Al Jazeera, and you were calling out fossil fuel firms. Specifically in it, you said, I thought fossil fuel firms could change. I was wrong. You long said you believed that they may be able to assist in fighting climate change, but what changed for you?
Patience. I think is what changed for me. I ran out of patience. And I ran out of patience not only because I have impatience as my DNA and my operating system, but also because the runway for us to be able to address climate in a timely fashion is totally running out. And it is inconceivable to me that those who are substantially responsible for A, having caused, but B, could be responsible, at least majorly responsible for lowering emissions, have apparently not noticed that we're running out of time. And instead of using their amazing, out of the park profits that they've had in the past 12 to 24 months, to accelerate their decarbonization by investing more into renewables. I understand that that's not their core business, but their core business has got to move beyond their core business. So instead of investing into renewables, instead of doing everything that they need to do and applying their amazing engineering capacity, they've been doing actually the opposite. They've been slowing down their decarbonization commitments. Prime example, Shell under new leadership. They've been paying higher dividends to their shareholders. They've been buying back shares. They have actually been lobbying governments to reverse climate energy policies. This is just inconceivable to me. Inconceivable. So, yeah, my patience ran out, and I say that with sadness, Sinclair, because I think in the whole climate community, I perhaps was one of the most patient and the most open to them, because I firmly believe that everyone has to contribute to this, and I wouldn't even want to accept them. Everyone has to contribute to the solution, and I do continue to believe that they could, if they so decide to do so, they could have an amazing impact on accelerating decarbonization. But they have decided not to do it, so my patience ran out.
So what then should the consequence be? I mean, I know out of California, we've actually seen legal suits, right? A lawsuit filed against big fossil fuel companies. Are you suggesting should there be legal action? Is there a consequence that could create some impact?
Well, California is actually quite a story because we do have quite a few climate litigation cases. Last time I looked, there were already above 1,500 cases at some degree of maturity, most of them, of course, in the United States. But many of them have been brought by young activists, good on them, or small groups, NGOs, good on them. But we had never seen a guerrilla come in to put forward a case against fossil fuel companies. So the state of California, one of the largest economies in the world, if not fifth, then sixth economy in the world, with the reach that it has, with the pockets that it has, with the legal team that it can assemble, they are suing 5 major fossil fuel companies: Exxon, Shell, Chevron, BP, and Conoco. And they're suing them because they are saying that they have known about climate change and have actually not been transparent about that knowledge, and in fact acted exactly in the opposite direction to that knowledge. And of course, we all know how California has suffered from climate impacts. We have seen that now for years. So what they're saying is that the state of California has to assume billions of dollars in damages, and they're suing the fossil fuel companies. That is a major, major upgrade, I would say, in the liabilities and in the reach that climate litigation can have. Now, having said that, I don't think that is, I think it's a very important lever of change, but it cannot be the only one. I would like, in case anybody was doing something else in New York during the march against fossil fuels, I haven't seen before a march in New York during General Assembly, during Climate Week, that specifically was focused on fossil fuels. I would say social license to operate has come to a screeching halt.
Why do you think that is?
And so whether it is from civil society or whether it is from the legal, sorry, Sinclair, I actually think that fossil fuel companies are being squeezed.
You think they're feeling the pressure right now?
Oh, yes. They're feeling the pressure. They're definitely feeling the pressure. They're also interestingly feeling the pressure in who they want to hire. I have it from very good source that fossil fuel companies are having a very hard time hiring the best and the brightest brains that are coming out of master's and doctorate degrees, because young people honestly are really having a think about whether they want to sell their brains to this kind of company, and that is a major hit for them. They need to renew their capacity to think through their strategy, and they're not getting any fresh brains.
Christiana, you've said, even here, right, that in the past you've been open to big oil being at the table. That brings my mind to COP28. We know it's going to be held in the United Arab Emirates with Sultan Al Jaber, a government minister in UAE who himself is a fossil fuel executive. Of course, we've heard from activists who have said big oil companies should not be a part of COP28 and other such gatherings. Do you agree with that?
I would like to take that question in 2 steps, Sinclair, if I may.
Please.
The first is the host country that becomes the president of COP certainly has the right to choose who they want to be COP president, and we've had people from many different sectors and occupations engaging and taking over that role. What is critical for me is not necessarily the sector that the newly minted COP president comes from, but rather whether the COP president is true to the mandate that is given to her or to him. And the mandate that is given to that person is to precisely not operate in protection of national interest, but rather to separate him or herself from the national interest and be completely open to all different political perspectives, because that person needs to engage openly in order to bring people to common ground. That is the concern that I was having at the very beginning, well, maybe for the first 6 months, where I didn't see that the COP president had actually understood that differentiation. One thing is his role at home, but another thing, very different, is the role that is entrusted upon him by the parties to the convention. Lately, I have seen that he is moving in that direction, which I celebrate, and I think he has understood the political international responsibility, multilateral responsibility that comes with that role. That's the first part. The other part to your question is whether fossil fuel companies should be participating. That of course is way beyond for me to decide. I would actually say it should depend on whether they are there to help and to accelerate decarbonization according to the pace and scale that is established by the Paris Agreement, or whether they are literally operating against those objectives. That is something that cannot be now that we are only a short 7 years before 2030, by which time we have to be at 1/2 global emissions compared to current.
Yeah. I appreciate your nuanced answer, because I think everyone in this room knows that climate is a nuanced issue. So let's talk about some other energy sources beyond fossil fuels, right? You have said that humanity already possesses the technologies it needs to rapidly reduce emissions. Of course, we know that in the world, fossil fuels still account for roughly 80% of total energy use. So to you, what are the most sort of salient examples of such technologies that we should be leaning into, the new technologies?
Well, I'm so glad we're getting to this, Sinclair. That is the most exciting story, and that is the narrative that I am hoping everyone in the room is really going to take with them, because I think reporting on climate, and I always have huge respect for those of you who report on climate, not easy. But I would say, moving up to where we are right now, the reporting on climate ought to balance two very important pillars, or in my terms, what I call two exponential curves. The first exponential curve is well covered by everyone, and that is the disasters that we're seeing, the growing impacts that are getting more frequent, more destructive, more harming of homes and livelihoods, much more impacting, frankly, human misery. And I do not need to give you the long list of what we have seen this year, admittedly amplified by El Nino. But the problem is that if we don't do our job, that amplification of El Nino will no longer be because of the amplification of El Nino, but it will begin to become the norm. And so I don't need to give you those examples. You know them, you have written about them, you have covered them. But there is another exponential curve. And to me, that is really where we have to pay attention, because these two curves are actually racing against each other. The fact that we have exponential increase in impacts, we know. But are we also covering the fact that we have an exponential curve in the market readiness and the deployment of renewable energies that just 5 years ago we would have thought, no, that is probably science fiction, but it is not. So a couple of very clear examples. Solar, offshore wind, and onshore wind have come down 80% in the past few years in cost. Batteries, 60%, EVs, 60%. And we now know that wind and solar are competitive in most of the geographies in the world, including global north and global south, which means that they're out-competing, certainly in functionality because they're much superior, but also on cost, they're out-competing fossil fuels. So what we know is that we will actually be able to reach 1/3 of all electricity on the global grid will be coming from solar and wind by 2030. Today, that's only 12%. So that is a huge step up over the next 7 years. Of course, we know that fossil fuel demand for electricity has not just peaked, but declined in OECD countries. Fossil fuel for electricity has peaked in most of the world and will decline very quickly because of the competitiveness and the outcompeting of the other energy generating sources. Now, EVs, a very similar exponential curve, right? We used to think that EV sales would grow by 15%. And actually the IEA put out their forecast in 2019 saying EVs will grow 15% by 2030. Well, actually, they grew 15% by 2022. That's 8 years earlier. And today we know that we're on track to surpass 2/3 of global car sales by 2030, including in leading car markets, which are the EU and the US, predictably, but more importantly, China and India. By 2027, the purchase price for EVs will actually be lower than the same model of fossil fuel. So what does that tell us? That tells us, A, that these technologies, and it's not all technologies, right? I've been very specific in which. So green hydrogen is not there yet. Certainly land use solutions are not there yet. But we already have the leading technologies that are going up the S-curve, are becoming exponential, and will be displacing very quickly the incumbent fuels and the incumbent technologies. We have got to report on that. I know that that is not easy because it's much simpler to report either on the negative impacts or in fact on linear progress, because that's the way our brains have been educated. But we have got to understand that this is exponential, that we stand a very important chance of making the 2030 deadline if we accompany the technology improvement with policies and measures and finance that will allow those technologies to move into the space that they can.
Yeah. Christiana, you touched on it, a few things. First, I'm glad you mentioned the Global South, because that was a question which I think you addressed, right? Are these new technologies both accessible and affordable? But B, I'm going to dovetail it because I'm tight on time and I have so many questions for you. I want to talk no, don't be sorry. I want to talk about your home country of Costa Rica as well. What are some of the learnings from the successes, the green accomplishments in your space that you think apply to other countries? I know that was a few too many questions, so take what you would like from it.
Yeah, well, Costa Rica, I mean, is a shining example because, well, we've actually never had fossil fuels. We just went straight into hydroelectricity last century, and we have stayed with all renewables. So all our electricity is clean. And we do import fossil fuels, regrettably, for our transportation. Now, because all our electricity is green, this is the country that should be moving and is moving very quickly into EVs, and we're actually, not surprisingly, the top country in Latin America in EV sales, because it just makes a lot of sense. We have the electricity and we're building out the infrastructure. Now, of course, one can say, okay, but Costa Rica is a shining example, but it is an exception because how many countries do you have with 100% clean energy? Few. So Iceland and Costa Rica come to mind, and that's about it. So it's not about setting Costa Rica up as a role model, because the path toward clean transport and clean electricity is one that has to be contextualized, is one that has to respond to the specifics of the economic conditions and, of course, to the natural resources of each country. What we can take as a lesson is it is possible. It is possible, but it takes government and private sector working together, one with policies and measures, and the other with the investment into the infrastructure or any of the other investments that need to be made. So we cannot rely just on the superiority of the technology. We have to buttress that with policy and investment.
Thank you. I appreciate that you said earlier, you know, the work of journalism is hard. It can be, as is your work. I wonder, as someone who interfaces with a lot of us, how would you cover climate differently? And you can be honest.
Well,
we won't turn the camera on.
Okay, fair enough. Well, as I was saying before, Sinclair, I do think that coverage on climate, and I started being much more aware of coverage on climate, obviously, when I took the responsibility at the Secretariat. And I have definitely witnessed, and I'm truly grateful for the increasing coverage, for the increasing granularity that is being devoted to this issue. And so there, I think that you're all doing a brilliant job. Where, frankly, you're not doing a brilliant job yet, but that is exactly the point of this conversation, is on helping people to understand that climate is definitely a responsibility. We are not going to lift the responsibility because, as I said in the beginning, this is on all of our shoulders. We should all be contributing to this. So climate is a responsibility. However, it is not necessarily a burden. And that is the piece that I think is relatively new in the past few years. I would say way back when, in 2010, when I started there, it was still a huge burden because the technologies were not right, because we hadn't really understood all of the ancillary benefits. But today we understand all of that. We understand all of the ancillary benefits of moving over to these technologies, that even if we didn't have climate change in the crazy world, that we would say, okay, well, actually climate change doesn't exist. Even then, it makes sense, just from a social, political, and broadly environmental point of view. It makes sense to move over to these technologies. So that is the piece, Sinclair, that I think we really need to dig into. Yes, climate is a responsibility, comma, and it is a huge opportunity, and comma, especially for the global south. Especially for the global south, because the global south, and I call myself in there in the global south because I come from Costa Rica, we do not have the infrastructure depth that the countries in the global north do. So from that perspective, we're more nimble. We can actually do the leapfrogging that we did with telephony. How many developing countries are now putting in lines for telephone and doing the ring, ring, ring? Who remembers the ring, ring, ring phone, right? That just doesn't make any sense. And so it is with renewable energy. We have to be able to portray renewable energy for what it is, a much superior technology, and one that is actually much better from so many different points of view, especially for fossil fuel importing countries in the south. So much better. Instead of importing these crazy fuels that have these crazy prices that are manipulated in times of war by crazy states, Instead of that, we should all be using our domestic sources. And the good thing about renewable energy is it is a broad portfolio where what we can harness in order to produce electricity. It is not just the single fossil fuel or two. It is a broad portfolio. So just from a political stability and a political security point of view, it makes so much sense for all of us to move over to our own domestically harvested and produced and generated renewable energy sources for electricity.
Christiana, I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I do want to open the floor to all of you, so I hope you've been paying attention, and we'll give you an opportunity to ask her something. I'm struck.
You hope who's paying attention, me?
Oh, not you. I can tell you're paying attention. Your optimism strikes me as someone who's been in this space for so long. Of course, a lot of terms have been introduced as of late, climate anxiety being one of them, right? We've seen heat waves. We're seeing once in a generation, insert whatever weather event you want, right? And I'm reminded that you're the co-founder of the NGO for Global Optimism. So just briefly and simply, what sustains your optimism and hope in this work?
You see, Sinclair, our optimism is not, sort of clear-eyed and, oh, okay, well, things are going to be fine, or somebody else is going to take care of it, or da, da, da. No. Our optimism is actually not the result of any achievement. It's actually the input. And Sinclair, here's the question. If you have a challenge ahead of you, whatever it is, professional, personal, whatever, if you do not enter into that challenge, approach that challenge with at least the hope, if not the optimism, that you're going to succeed, of course you're not going to succeed. Of course, because that is a self-fulfilling prophecy. So for me, optimism, frankly, is a responsibility. I make it a daily choice. I read the newspapers. I read everything that comes out. I know the situation that we're in. And precisely because of that, Sinclair, precisely because of the situation, that is why we have to turn to our responsibility and say, precisely because of that, precisely because of the dire consequences of not facing climate change, that's why we have to put all our ingenuity onto the solution space.
Yeah.
So it's not simply exporting responsibility. It is actually about focusing our energies. Sinclair, here's my best story on that.
Oh, okay.
I am the mother of 2 children. If I am standing by the road and I see that there is a huge bus approaching fast, really fast, and my 2 children are walking onto the street, do I stand on the curb and hope that somebody else is going to do something? Do I say the bus is going to stop? Do I don't know. What? The only thing that I do is I ran like hell. I run like hell to take my daughters off the street. That's what we're not doing. That is exactly what we have to do. Run like hell to take the next 7 generations off the street.
Christiana, I could see the passion and the emotion in your eyes. Thank you for sharing. Thank you. Let's give her a round of applause. And then with your questions. So now we'll take questions. I do ask, please be concise in your questions. We are over Zoom and as clear as you can be.
Oh, okay. Hi, thank you so much for doing this. You've spoken about feeling optimistic about the energy transition, given the declining cost of renewable energy. I'm wondering to what extent you feel similarly optimistic about the conversations around loss and damage funding.
And they're so linked, right? They're so linked because honestly, the longer it takes for us to assume our responsibility, the deeper the loss and damage is going to be. So for me, those are intricately linked. They are financially, mathematically, but above all, morally interlinked. Morally interlinked. And yes, loss and damage, in fact, the entire chapter of adaptation is the Cinderella of our negotiations. It is so far behind so far behind. And every day it gets worse and worse behind, farther and farther behind. Why? Because we're not doing mitigation the way that we should. So it's not like we can choose between the two. Come on, we have two arms, we have two legs, we can definitely do two things at the same time. We have to accelerate mitigation because that's the only way to keep adaptation, loss, and damage within any stretch of the imagination, within the manageable. If adaptation, loss, and damage goes completely out of the manageable globally, we have really abdicated our responsibility.
Thank you. I'll take the next question over there.
Thank you. Wonder if you could comment on what you see as the role of grassroots movements pushing at the local, national, and international level, pushing governments to change the policies, and pushing industry to move in the terms that you described. And can you also then talk about the role of the media in covering those movements? Thank you.
Yes, yes, and yes. That's my answer. Yes, absolutely. Yes, we need that pressure. I mean, history shows that mega important social, political changes in our society have never occurred without pressure from civil society. They just don't occur. And we know that that governments tend to follow public opinion and not lead it, sadly. And so yes, public opinion needs to push and media needs to cover that so that the push can be felt. And let's think about this as push and pull, right? So civil society ought to continue pushing, and thank you to everyone who was on the streets in New York, and it has to continue. That's the push. The pull is precisely the competitiveness of those technologies, and hopefully more technologies that will be joining the exponential curve, including land-based and nature-based solutions. So that's the pull. But we can't rely only on the pull. It has to be a combination of push and pull. And yes, civil society has to continue to push, and thank you for covering that.
Thank you.
Katrina Vanden Heuvel, The Nation. Thank you, Executive Secretary, for your insights and humanity. You spoke earlier of that it was above your pay grade to decide if the fossil fuel companies would attend COP. Yet in your Al Jazeera op-ed, you did speak to how they were opposing the agenda of decarbonization. And if they did oppose, that they shouldn't attend. So I wanted to pursue the question. You said it was nuanced, but you put it fairly straightforwardly in the Al Jazeera op-ed.
Yes, because in fact, even in the op-ed, I'm saying they have to decide. They have, from now until COP28, they have to decide which way they're going to push. And I'm always open for miracles in this life. Honestly, I'm very much in the market of miracles. So if a miracle is that some of them will actually stand up and lead the herd, leave and lead the herd, and be responsible, that is a voice that we want to hear. The problem is that they are so much acting as a pack, and none of them want to separate themselves. And so, of course, there's comfort in numbers and comfort in, I don't know, comfort zones that they have been occupying for way too long. But yes, I'm always open for miracles, and yes, I would really applaud if some of them would stand up, leave the herd, and lead into the future.
If there is no miracle, and we all pray for miracles, would you suggest that the fossil fuel companies not participate in COP?
No, I'm going to come down on that side. No, if they're going to be there only to be obstreperous and only to put spanners into the system, they should not be there.
Hello, I have a question about the Paris Agreement. So in 2015, the agreement was forged with optimism and global commitment, and you played a really important role in it. So I will appreciate your insights into the challenges and also the opportunities you foresee for the agreement's future evolution in the context of the accelerating climate change impacts and international efforts. Thank you.
Well, it's an important question because I think we all realize that we're in a very, very different situation now than we were in 2015. Let us understand that COPs were designed, and I say this with a certain authority because I was a part of the group of people who designed the COPs before COP1. So COPs were designed with one specific purpose in mind, and that is to be the multilateral base, platform for countries to come together to decide on those guardrails that are of global engagement in order to address climate change in a timely fashion. Those guardrails were substantially put in place in Paris, and then followed up with the rule book, the Paris rule book, a few years later. Substantially, those pieces that require multilateral engagement have been set. It is now for governments to take the implications of those decisions to their domestic arena and enact the policies, the legislations, the incentives, the measures that will enact the Paris Agreement, which was put in place for the global level, but has to be implemented at a national level. That is the piece that I don't see forthcoming. I see it in the United States with the 3 bills that were passed by the Biden administration, certainly in the EU, upcoming in Australia, but it's few and far between. Most countries are not following up with their domestic policy. So to me, that is the prime responsibility of governments now, is to look at their domestic policy, where multilateral engagement is not the issue anymore. It's do your homework. Do your homework at home. The piece that is still missing has already been asked, which is what happens with loss and damage, what happens with financial support. Those pieces are still at the multilateral level of negotiation. That piece is still there. But most of the pieces have been done and they're not being implemented. So for me, if we want to continue having the COPs, and most people do, then we have to redesign the COPs, because it is no longer a 100% multilateral negotiation issue. Yes, there are some very important, and especially issues that are important to developing countries, that still need multilateral attention. But that multilateral attention, frankly, is distracting governments from doing their homework at home, which is the policies, the measures, the incentives that they should be putting in place to execute and implement the Paris Agreement. Now, aside or side by side, adjacent to the formal area of the COP, of course, we have this explosion of all other stakeholders that are not national governments, well, sometimes also national governments, but substantially all other stakeholders who use the COP as an opportunity to show each other what they're doing, to network with each other, to support each other, to accelerate each other. That is a very good thing. The question is should those two pieces continue to operate side by side? They're actually looking at two completely different issues. So I do think that it would be worthwhile to take this whole package and do a rethink a rethink about how do we redesign these opportunities so that they actually can serve the urgent goals that we have in front of us,
Yeah.
serve them more effectively.
Thank you.
Secretary, thank you so much for doing this. Mitchell Beer from the Energy Mix in Ottawa, Canada. You say you would like to see some fossil companies step away from the herd and show up at COP28 the way you would like them to. Do you have any in mind who are leaning in that direction? And for bonus points, can you name names?
I don't have any in mind. That's the sad thing. It is very, very sad. Those I would say that have more leeway would be not the government-owned companies, but rather the publicly traded companies. I would say have a little bit more leeway to do something like that. The issue, I think, is who the handbrake is their shareholders. And it is the shareholders who have become accustomed to the level of dividends that they're now reaping, and who are so attached to that core business that they have a hard time looking at another business. So I think it's very much of a friction there, even if leadership might want to step aside from the herd. The conversation and the friction is between leadership and shareholders.
Thank you. We have time for one more question.
Thank you so much again for talking with us. As a climate and environment reporter, I'm very excited to cover advances in renewable energy technology. But at the same time, I'm thinking about balance when it comes to sort of getting issues of environmental pollution, loss of biodiversity, human rights violations when it comes to extracting a lot of important minerals that we need to make a lot of the renewable energy technology possible. And, you know, sort of accountability to that end. I'm curious how people like you are sort of thinking about these things.
I think there are two pieces to your conversation. First, on extraction of minerals, I would point you to a very interesting study that has come out from RMI, where they compare the metals and minerals that are necessary for renewables versus those that are necessary for fossil fuels. So it's not quite as black and white as one might think. I very much encourage you to take a look at that. But the other part of your question, I think, is equally, if not more important, and that is what young people have taught me is called intersectionality. And that certainly is another novelty that were not as aware of that in 2015, and that is the very, very intricate relationship that exists between fossil fuels, climate change, gender issues, patriarchy, inequalities. So many of the social, political challenges that we are dealing with should not be considered in silos onto themselves, but rather we have to challenge ourselves to look at all of these issues with a much more integral mentality and understand that those complexities are part of the reality. It is just us in our, infinite wisdom that at some point decided, okay, the only way that we can understand this and wrap our heads around it is we're going to parse this out into tidy little silos. Well, the reality of society and of politics and of economics is that it is not parsed out into those nice little silos. So that I would add that to yet the list of challenges of covering climate, and therefore I totally agree with you that we cannot cover climate as though it were simply an environmental issue or as though there were a technological fix to it. That is just one small part of it, and we have to be able to recognize and address the full complexity of it.
Well, thank you for helping us dive into so many of the complexities of climate change today. Can we just please give Christiana Figueres a round of applause? We so appreciate you making time for us. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Sinclair. Thank you for your good questions. Thank you to those who asked questions, and especially thank you for making an extra effort to really upgrade the coverage of climate. We all need that. Thanks very much.
Thank you.